Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. Why some medieval nobles were buried wearing chastity belts. It was one of those long, quiet nights when the wind slipped between the monastery's tiles as if whispering ancient secrets to anyone willing to listen. My lantern was already lit, feet wrapped in soft wool, and my thoughts drifting through the shadows of a leather-bound manuscript, a funerary inventory from a distant abbey. And there, amid forgotten names and faded coats of arms, I found something curious, even unsettling. A careful drawing of an iron belt, locked around the body of a soul already gone. It wasn't meant to protect a maiden as in the old tales. It was to guard something of his, something that mustn't escape, not even after death. They said he was a count, wealthy, powerful, feared. And still, when carried to the cold earth, he had asked, or had been compelled, to be buried with that relic of shame. In those times, men feared the judgment of heaven more than the enemy's blade. And so, they often hid their failings more zealously than they flaunted their triumphs. Some whispered the belt was a final penance, an armor against temptation, even in eternal slumber. Others, less kind, muttered that the count had suffered from ailments of the flesh, the kind no physician dared write down, yet all could recognize by the sour scent of urine or the stained bedsheets tucked away in shame. There were those who said he died distrusting everyone, even himself, that he feared temptation not only in life but beyond it, as if the desires that had haunted his body might chase after his soul. In those days, people believed the body bore marks for divine judgment, that unspoken sins could be read in bones. So why not protect oneself? Why not lock the very doorway of the flesh, like someone sealing a chest of unspeakable secrets? It was a gesture of desperation or control, as if one could bargain with the heavens, offering late abstinence in exchange for absolution. But not all who rested beneath those iron locks did so out of faith. In older tombs, excavated south of Poitiers, if I recall, they found remains of nobles in rigid poses, almost defensive, with bronze buckles corroded by time still fastened at the hips. Scholars debate. Some believe these concealed more worldly secrets, impotence perhaps, or hidden betrayals, scandals muffled by coin in the right hands. A man whose honor rested on virility might prefer the legend of a chaste vow over the whisper of weakness. And so the body was sealed with a lock, as if the truth lay there, imprisoned beside the shame. I remember well a night by the fire, when an old scribe told me of a Flemish knight whose tomb was sealed with as much metal as a warrior's, but not upon the hands or chest. A man who never married, though he had wealth and name. The gossips, always quicker than church bells, claimed he was too devoted to the flesh and its fevers. Others, more generous, believed he had imposed upon himself the silence of desire as a path to redemption. And in the end, as he arranged his own burial, he had asked to be locked, as if forever closing the doors of a house he no longer trusted with visitors. It is strange to think how, in those days, honor did not end with death. It passed through the veil, stretching into eternity. A man might be judged by what he carried in his coffin, just as much as by what he left in his will. And the chastity belt, in that context, wasn't merely a symbol of restraint, but of performance. A final gesture before God and men attempting to shape the memory left behind. Perhaps by donning such a device, the departed cried out in silence, "I was not weak, I was faithful," or "Forgive me, for I tried," even if his life told a different story. Sometimes I wonder how many of these stories were true and how many were born of fear. Fear that secrets might escape with the last breath. Fear that the body, once freed from the soul, would reveal its true history. In the Middle Ages, every inch of flesh could be read as message or accusation, scars, marks, strange protrusions. All were read by monks and midwives as signs of sin or sanctity. And sex, oh, sex was a strange coin, glorified in the hymns of matrimony, yet feared as the fiercest of sins. So a locked body was, in a way, a request for silence. And there was the theatre of it all. We mustn't forget that noble funerals were spectacles. There were processions, laments, priests chanting psalms, while pages bore crests. If a count died with a tarnished reputation, burying him with gold wasn't enough. One had to convince everyone, and perhaps the heavens, that he departed purified, and the belt, heavy and cold, served that purpose. It was more than iron. It was a narrative, a visual argument, as if to say, here lies a man who resisted, or who at least tried. The truth, as always, was far harder to bury than the body. Of course, not all scholars agree with these interpretations. Some claim those funeral chastity belts may not have been belts at all, that they might have been ceremonial adornments, crude medical devices, or even archaeological misreadings. Yet whenever I leaf through certain monks' journals, there is always a note, a whisper, a veiled confession. He was buried with chains of penance, or he carried a lock upon his belly, as if fearing the temptations of eternal sleep. In times when body and soul fought for space, it was hard to know where faith ended and fear began. As for me, I like to believe there was something deeply human in those gestures. Even if wrapped in iron, even if shrouded in liturgical veils and Latin prayers, there was within a yearning for redemption, to pretend one could begin again, even at the end of the road. And how can we not see in that a trace of tenderness? How often do we too hide what we are, fearing the eyes of others? How many of us lock away our own desires, our failures, behind invisible latches, hoping the world will judge us with more mercy than truth? Once, on a foggy morning, I walked among the graves of an old chapel in ruins, stone upon stone, names erased, moss weaving secrets through the cracks. And there, among forgotten relics, I laid my hand on a slab marked with only one symbol, a key, no date, no crest, no name. Just that simple engraving, etched at the stone's center, like a whisper. I asked the caretaker what he knew of the tomb. He shrugged and said, repeating an old tale, they say he locked his own body, so heaven wouldn't know what he had done. I lingered there a long while, listening to distant bells and the murmuring leaves dancing in the wind. And I thought that perhaps this is what binds us most to those who lived centuries before us. Not war, nor titles, nor castles, but the wish to be remembered only for what we chose to hide. Back then, locking the body was a way to silence the soul. Today, we do so with half-spoken words, carefully placed smiles, and long-chosen silences. But deep down, we remain the same, fragile creatures trying to wear armor against the truth. It's curious how these cold iron objects could carry such emotional heat. The heat of shame, of doubt, of guilt, and perhaps too the warmth of a final gesture of self-love. Because shame doesn't always come from wickedness. Often, it rises from the sadness of not being who we wish to be. And in the hush of a tomb, where even the laments of the living cannot reach, a locked belt became the last confidant of a man who wanted to erase part of himself, or at least make it unrecognizable to the eyes of God. In the end, we all leave traces, be it words in letters, faces in portraits, or even ironwork among bones. And these men, buried with locks and clasps, left behind a trail that still intrigues, moves, and confounds. Not because they were saints or monsters, but because they were human. So human, they preferred to wear a lie of iron rather than let truth lie bare. And so, centuries later, we still try to decode their secrets, with archaeologists in place of confessors, and with history's echo whispering softly in our ear, there is more to death than the absence of life. There are stories locked away, and sometimes keys lost. Sometimes, when sleep lingers and the fire murmurs alone in the dark, I think of those forgotten keys. I think of how many may never have been forged, of how many belts were fastened with no intention of ever being undone. And I wonder if, deep down, it was truly about chastity, or simply another attempt at control in a world that slipped through their fingers. Because medieval life, though rigid in rules, was wildly unstable in affections, in beliefs, in bodies. Order had to be invented, even in death. And perhaps that's why I find a certain tenderness in the gesture. Yes, tenderness. For even a funerary chastity belt, with all its harsh symbolism, is a declaration of fragility. A reminder that even the most powerful men carried doubt. That even nobles, draped in robes and preceded by liturgical choirs, trembled before divine judgment. And the gaze of the living. And if the iron pressed tightly, so be it. Better the pain of metal than the exposure of the soul. Better a lost key than a truth laid bare. And so we go on, we who live centuries later, slowly unlocking these sealed stories. Sometimes with awe, sometimes with compassion. Because deep down, we know there is something universal in the act of hiding what shames us. Whether it's with half-spoken words, averted glances, or silences too long. In the past, they did it with iron and prayer. Today, with excuses and distraction. But the essence is the same, a wish to protect ourselves from the pain of being fully seen. On the last page of that inventory I mentioned, between scratched-out crests and the abbot's notes, there was an almost erased scribble. It read, "May the Lord see only what he chose to show." I read those words many times until they became part of my own silence. For in them echoes something that spans the centuries. The choice to show only a part, to perform virtue when the soul is weary. And to hope, perhaps, that on the other side of the veil, someone, divine or not, might understand that sometimes to lock oneself away is the quietest form of asking for forgiveness. So when I hear the gentle creak of old hinges here in my room, or the wood settling under the weight of night, I often imagine that some veiled spirit still walks among us, wearing their private armor, seeking rest. Not for the body, which is long gone, but for the memory they left behind. And perhaps by telling their stories with gentleness and wonder, we are slowly unlocking those souls, welcoming them not as examples of virtue or shame, but as dusty mirrors of our own frailties. And thus ends another sleeping memory, left by someone who didn't wish to be forgotten, but didn't want to be fully remembered either. May your night be serene, and may the secrets you keep, like theirs, find peace, whether behind locks or in the gentle hands of time. Good night, memory traveler. Until our next vigil. The strange fashion of armpit-sniffing maidens in the Middle Ages. I remember a particularly strange summer when fairs stretched across the fields like living tapestries, stitched with colourful tents, the scent of fresh bread and voices echoing from every corner of the shire. It was the season of harvests and tournaments, of theatrical jesters and whispered prophecies by the well. And amid all that clamour of swords and laughter, a custom emerged so peculiar that even now, so many winters later, it still draws from me a quiet smile and a soft question in my chest. The armpit-sniffing maidens. I say this without mockery, for at the time the practice was regarded with near sacred seriousness. The young girls, always maidens, always chosen for some blend of beauty and discretion, would line up in the shadows of the bleachers or in the corners of the pavilions, awaiting knights returning sweaty from the arena or the road. And when one of them stopped before them, weary, dust-covered and full of honor, they would lean forward in silence and inhale deeply the scent from beneath his arms. There was no irony in their faces, only a reverent curiosity, like one reading a prophecy written in the vapor of skin. It was said that a man's sweat carried more than the fatigue of his journey. To some, it was testimony of strong blood, inner vitality, a hidden blessing woven between muscle and salt. Some swore that by breathing in the right odor, a maiden could feel a sort of ancestral calling stir in her belly. A silent sign that the man was fertile, courageous, and perhaps worthy of fathering a lineage. It was a rite somewhere between sensuality and superstition, cloaked in beliefs that physicians avoided debating and poets adored embellishing with daring metaphors. I remember Madeleine, a girl with braids woven with dried flowers, daughter of a shoemaker from Rennes. She was chosen to serve as a virgin nose during a summer tournament hosted by the local count. Her eyes were calm as a lake at dusk, but her nostrils, they said, held the gift of truth. With each knight who approached, she closed her eyes, sighed slightly, and would say things like, "He smells of lavender, iron, and warm milk. This one will survive the winter." And as strange as it may seem, many believed her. Some even changed their marriage plans based on Madeleine's olfactory reading. At that fair, the banners rippled in the warm wind, and the scent of male sweat mingled with old leather, and horses hovered like an invisible curtain over everything. It wasn't an easy smell, nor a pleasant one, but there was something honest about it, something that reminded us life was made of effort, of dust, of blood that pulses beneath layers of mail. And for those girls, raised between embroidery hoops and rosaries, smelling a man fresh from battle was like touching for a moment the raw heart of the world. Mothers, contrary to what one might imagine, encouraged the practice. They claimed it helped in choosing a good suitor, that the nose was wiser than the eyes. After all, a handsome face could hide cowardice, and a gentle smile could mask laziness. But a smell, the smell, that was harder to fake. Some girls, bolder, brought embroidered handkerchiefs to absorb the scent and take it home, as if carrying a secret folded in cloth. There were even improvised prayers, asking the scent to reveal what the eyes could not see. I recall an old apothecary who watched everything with a curious gaze. His name was Bertrand, and he often murmured that a man's sweat was the letter the body writes when the soul forgets how to speak. Far too poetic for a seller of ointments. But perhaps he was right. Bertrand claimed a good scent wasn't perfumed, but true, that between the pores lay a secret script of hormones, fevers, and intentions, and that virgins, being pure and untouched, had the gift of reading it unfiltered. He even claimed to have cured a fever just by watching the twitch of a maiden's nose. But of course there was mockery. Young boys would exaggerate the gesture, diving their noses into each other's armpits and screaming as if possessed by demons of stench. And some knights, vain as ever, would douse themselves in herbs and flowers before presenting themselves, hoping to deceive the ritual, which, according to the more experienced maidens, ruined everything. Perfume confused the body's signals, and then the nose could no longer be trusted. It had to be naked sweat, the smell after effort, after battle, after the dust of the road. That was the scent worthy of being read. At times, the ritual took on nearly ceremonial contours. A small linen tent would be raised, adorned with ribbons and sprigs of rosemary. Inside, a single chair was placed, and the knight entered alone, still glowing from battle. The girl then approached silently, placing her hands gently on her knees and bending forward as if listening to an ancient prayer. Those outside could not see, only imagine. And perhaps because of that, the scene became even more powerful. A simple gesture, but heavy with symbolism, as if a soul, not just a body, was being judged. There were, of course, those who fell in love. 1 or 2 knights returned to the fair in the days that followed, offering apples, painted shields, even little poems to the girls who had, for a moment, breathed deeply by their side. And they, blushing, pretended disinterest, but tucked the notes between the pages of their prayers. No one said love began there, but everyone knew. For the nose, before the heart, already sensed the quiet lean of affection that might bloom shyly between skin and silence. Some of those stories I saw end in marriage, others in longing, and all in memory. In time, the practice began to lose its prestige. More skeptical healers arrived, stricter lords and ladies who turned up their noses, not at the smell, but at the gesture. They said it was unseemly, that girls of good lineage should not bow their heads before sweaty warriors. Science, too, began to whisper its new winds through castle corridors, with difficult words and theories that had no place in the heart of a fairground. And so, the custom faded like the embers of a fire at dawn, slow, crackling, almost without notice. But among the elders, those who lived when the world was still guided by omens and scents, the memory endured. There was something sacred in it all, they said. As if sweat were not merely sweat, but a trace of the soul exhaled through the pores, something invisible and unmeasurable, but felt like sorrow in the wind, or hope in the scent of baking bread. The sniffing maidens, with their handkerchiefs and closed eyes, were more than a curiosity. They were bridges between the body and the mystery. And even now, when I catch the scent of damp leather or earth after rain, I sometimes find myself remembering that tent, the warm breeze of the fair, and the ancient whisper of a world that once said, "The body speaks." And there are those who know how to listen. Once, many years later, I found Madeleine as an old woman, seated in the shade of a plum tree, a piece of embroidery in her lap, and her hair as white as the veils she once wore at the fairs. She still had that serene, distant gaze, as if listening to songs only time could hear. We talked for a long while, and between soft laughter and gentle recollections, I asked if she remembered the days when her nose decided fates. She smiled, without lifting her eyes from the needle, and said simply, "I do. Some men smelled of fear, others of hunger for glory, but there was one, just one, who smelled like home." I never forgot that phrase, because perhaps deep down, that's what we sought in those days, a hint of shelter in another's flesh, a trace of belonging in someone else's skin. And even if today it all seems like an absurd tale, stitched with the loose threads of superstition, there is an inexplicable tenderness in remembering that once we believed love could be sensed through the air, like a fragrance that wraps around us before we even know its name. And if that memory still warms the heart on cold nights, then perhaps it was never foolishness, only poetry. In the village where I grew up, the elder women liked to say that in ancient times you could tell whom a girl would dream of that night just by watching how her nose twitched during an encounter. "The body knows before the heart," they would say, as they peeled roots and blew herb smoke to ward off the evil eye. Maybe it was exaggeration, or just the desire to find magic where there was only shyness. But I like to believe it, that scent left traces in our dreams, like invisible footprints upon the pillow. As years passed, new fashions arrived, new rituals, new fairs with louder distractions. Maidens no longer lined up under bleachers, and the nights, now glazed in foreign perfumes, seemed less willing to offer their raw humanity to the judgment of an attentive nose. The tents were taken down, the embroidered handkerchiefs forgotten at the bottom of chests, and Madeleine's words slowly scattered on the breeze of memory. But on nights like this, when the world grows quiet and only the whisper of embers remains, I can still feel it, that warm breeze laced with dust, leather, sweat, and a strange comfort. Because there is something deeply human in that old desire to understand another, not only with our eyes or words, but with our most instinctive senses, as if the timid heart needed help from the nose to make up its mind. Perhaps that's why, back then, scent wasn't seen as something shameful, but as a kind of hidden truth. Bodies spoke, they said, and sometimes they spoke more clearly than their owners. And the girls who knew how to listen with their noses were not seen as foolish, but as sensitives, readers of a language only silence understood. Today, The fairs are different. The bleachers gave way to stages, and knights wear suits instead of armor. We no longer sniff someone before falling in love, at least not so openly. But sometimes, in an unexpected hug or a coat lent on a cold night, we still find something of the old ritual. A faint echo of those afternoons when maidens bent not out of submission but out of wisdom, searching in the fleeting scent of another's skin for some trace of eternity. And remembering that, with eyes half closed and the warmth of the blanket rising to my shoulders, I let sleep take me, as if every dream too began with a gentle breath and a perfumed memory of who we once were. And if anyone asks me one day whether it truly happened, if there really were girls paid to sniff the sweat of warriors, perhaps I'll smile and simply say yes, that in those days we believed in many things, but that some beliefs held a beauty that needed no explanation. For more than science or doctrine, they bloomed from the need to trust our senses, to search for signs in everything, in the flight of birds, in the creak of wood, and yes, in the scent of skin after battle. Thus ended that strange custom, somewhere between the sacred and the intimate, wrapped in light fabrics, whispers, and closed eyes. It faded like so many other traditions lost to time, not for lack of meaning, but perhaps because it demanded a kind of sensitivity the modern world no longer tends to. But in my memory, it remains quiet, warm, almost invisible, like the trace of an old perfume forgotten between the pages of a book. And with that soft image, I say goodnight, wishing your rest to be gentle, and may your dreams, if they carry any scent, bring memories sweet and kind, like a summer fair long vanished from time. When knights used human feces as a weapon of war, I remember that night well. The stench arrived before the news. It was high summer when the heat made the hay hiss underfoot and the wood of the palisade crackle as if it too was sweating. The sky was still, a heavy blue, windless, and yet a warm breeze carried to us a smell that had no name, only an obvious origin. It was as if the whole world had begun to rot, and we stood at the very heart of the decay. I was standing guard on the outer walls, a young squire still learning to fasten the helmet's buckles without stumbling over his own thoughts, when I saw the first projectile, a swollen sack flying through the sky like a sick bird. Our commander, an old knight with a stone voice and breath like fermented turnips, merely muttered, "It has begun." There was no trumpet blast, no war cry. Only the wet thud of that sack against the gate tower, followed by a dark splatter and an embarrassed silence. It was feces, human waste mixed with straw, rags, and who knows what else. A weapon, yes, but also a message. They weren't there just to conquer. They had come to make us sick, to drive us mad, to force us into surrender without ever drawing a sword. It was a war without glory, where heroes had to cover their noses with vinegar-soaked cloth and sleep with buckets of herbs beside their beds. The next morning, the archers did not ready their arrows. Instead, they stacked bundles of filthy clothes stripped from corpses, wrapped rotting animal remains already teeming with maggots, and tied them up carefully, as if packing cruel gifts. These bundles were hoisted and hurled by catapults, groaning under the weight of rot. The projectiles soared over the walls with a sinister grace, and when they landed, they did not cut with blades, but with stench, with sickness, and with a fear that gnawed from within. It was a vile art, this invisible war, where death arrived before the battle, and often without it. I remember one of the older soldiers, a broad-handed peasant with sorrowful eyes, told me as we rubbed vinegar under our nostrils, "It's not always the sword that kills, lad. Sometimes defeat comes through the gut." And he was right. Soon, the fever began to rise through the bodies. Even the smallest wounds flared like embers beneath the skin. There was vomiting, delirium, and an eerie silence in tents that had once echoed with jokes about stale bread and worn-out boots. The enemy didn't need to scale the walls. They only had to wait. Each morning, we counted those who did not rise, and to bury them became an act of courage, for the disease's touch was subtle, yet firm. I still remember when the cook, Mistress Alea, a small woman with brisk steps and arms that always smelled of rosemary, closed the kitchen for 2 whole days. "The air is sick," she said, as she poured lime into the cracks in the floor. She burned the tablecloths, boarded up the windows with planks, and told us to suck on bits of charcoal dipped in honey. No one argued. When a woman who'd survived 3 winters without bread speaks with tear-filled eyes, even the most stubborn knight obeys in silence. There was something in the air, something unseen, yet felt in the skin, the sleep and the dreams. At night, the fortress corridors seemed to shrink. We walked with cloths over our faces and tired eyes, like ghosts of our former selves. The candles flickered more than usual, as if they too were afraid. The sound of something falling in the courtyard, a pot, perhaps, or a body, no longer made anyone run. We simply looked at one another silently and waited for the next day. The enemy did not shout, did not charge on horseback, did not demand surrender. They merely launched their putrid gifts day after day, like a patient cook seasoning a pot of despair. It was during one of those suffocating early mornings that I saw, for the first time, a knight's eyes well with tears. Sir Audric, whose name echoed in fairground ballads, the very one who had faced bandits in the forests of Albrun and withstood 3 sieges, sat beside me on the wall's parapet, a damp cloth over his face and trembling hands. "I'd rather 100 swords to my chest than another day with this stench in my lungs," he murmured, and then he fell quiet, listening only to the groaning of the enemy's catapult in the distance, a sound we had come to dread as though it were the roar of an invisible beast. That night, it rained. A blessing, some said. A trap, said Alea. And she was right. The rain spread the filth through the alleys, mingling with the rotting remains and forming thick puddles that reeked of disease. The ground became a muddy soup of plagues. Boots sank, rats rejoiced, dogs howled as if the very earth were weeping. We tried building makeshift barriers of mud and stone to redirect the water, but it was too late. The central courtyard turned into a fetid swamp. The chickens grew sick, the children stopped laughing, and we began writing farewell letters without knowing to whom. But it was on the 5th day that we finally understood the cruelest purpose behind that tactic. It wasn't merely to kill, it was to break the spirit, to undo the order within the walls slowly, like rain washing away a forgotten parchment. Arguments flared among the soldiers. Suspicion spread. "He coughed yesterday," they whispered, pointing fingers with eyes full of fear. Brotherhood unraveled like a spider's web under a sharp wind. We slept apart, daggers at hand, no longer against the enemy outside, but fearing the fevered breath of the one beside us. Then, the monks of the chapel, in a gesture of quiet defiance, began burning resin and dried leaves on the altar. The smoke was thick, perfumed with laurel, and it spread through the corridors like a timid embrace, trying to push the stench away. Each morning they walked out in procession, hoods drawn low, chanting soft hymns, as if their voices could seal the cracks of fear. Many mocked them, others gave thanks in silence. And young as I was, found comfort in hearing their litany while washing my face with vinegar and watching the enemy's catapults in the distance, still and resting like beasts that knew time was on their side. On the 7th morning, something changed. The sky woke clouded, not by mist, but by the bittersweet stench of burning bodies beyond the walls. The enemy had set fire to their own dead, perhaps to hide the number of their losses, or perhaps to ensure no pestilence crept back their way. The smoke rose in thick columns, tinting the sun amber, as though the entire sky had passed through a fire made of sorrow. Some among us took it as a sign they were retreating, others as preparation for the final assault. The truth? No one knew. But that day the silence outside was more unsettling than the sound of the catapults. At dusk, the chapel bells rang on their own. I swear, there was no wind. The slow toll echoed along the stone walls like an ancient warning. Sir Audric, pale and gaunt, said it was time to write our sins on cloth and tie them to our belts so God could recognize them in the afterlife. We laughed, that tired laugh of men who no longer knew what they feared. But that night, when the fortress dimmed and the torches faltered, we all wore white strips of fabric tied to our waists. Superstition, like fear, always finds a place when reason no longer does. Then came the 9th day, and with it, complete silence. No stones hurled, no howls from the field, no campfire smoke, only the unsettling stillness of an absent enemy. I walked slowly to the south tower, where the crows still circled lazily above the siege camp. Down below, amid the tall weeds and the marks in the earth, there were no signs of life. The tents had been dismantled in haste, leaving crooked stakes and forgotten cloths fluttering in the wind. It was as if they had vanished. Some said they had fallen to their own weapon, victims of the same filth they threw at us. Others claimed a sudden plague took them, divine punishment perhaps. But old Ermin, who had lived with one eye closed since the Saxon Wars, said something that sent a chill through me. They left because they won. That hurt more than any invasion would have. He was right. They had no need to scale our walls or break down the gates. They defeated us through abandonment. The fortress reeked of defeat, not of a battle lost, but of the quiet certainty that we had unraveled from within. When the gates finally opened and the messengers from the neighboring city entered with cloths over their faces and cautious eyes, they didn't find heroes. They found weary men and women, thin and wary, like animals that had long since stopped dreaming of sunlight. Days passed before anyone dared light a fire in the courtyard. The fear of stirring the dust of our sins still lingered in the air. But little by little, we began to wash the corridors with lavender and nettle infusions, tear the sickened cloths, and bury deep anything touched by the plague or by its memory. The monks recited psalms as they scattered salt across the doorways, and even the children, far too quiet for their age, helped scrub the walls with brushes made of dry roots. It was not just stone we cleansed, it was our souls. And even so, the smell persisted, that sour undertone that seemed to whisper, "I was here." One afternoon, while organizing the stores in the cellar, I found something unexpected. A small sprig of rosemary, dry but still fragrant, tucked inside a barrel of old wine. Someone had left it there, perhaps as an offering, perhaps as hope. I tucked it behind my ear, the way my mother used to on festival days. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled without fear. It was a foolish gesture, almost childlike, but in that moment it meant everything. The war wasn't over. Winter was still coming, but deep inside me, a small part began to believe that after so much stench and fever, life, simple, quiet, and smelling of herbs, could still bloom. When the surrounding fields began to show signs of life again, birds perching on the towers, crickets returning to the cool night air, we knew the worst had passed. No one celebrated aloud. It was like waking after a long fever, when the body still trembles, but the sweat has cooled and delirium gives way to clarity. We simply gathered the fishing nets, cleaned the wells, replanted the herbs. The children began to run again, though their feet still avoided certain stones in the yard. The dogs, once gaunt and silent, barked once more. The village, little by little, was relearning how to breathe. Sir Audric, now with a beard whiter than I thought possible, summoned us one morning and spoke in a voice tired but steady. They came with invisible swords, and one without blood. Let that be our lesson. And he returned to his tower without waiting for applause. His words stayed with me, because the cruelest battles, I realized, are not always made of steel and screams. Sometimes they are made of patience, rot, and silence. and yet they leave scars just as deep. But I also learned that after plague, fear and loss, there is always a handful of fertile earth where, with care and time, we may plant again, and wait, and bloom, like those who, even covered in the filth of war, still dream of spring. On the final night before the siege was officially declared over, we dined together. All of us, the remaining soldiers, the monks, the women who cared for the sick, the quiet-eyed children. We sat around a fire lit in the courtyard where there had once been only mud and bird bones. Alea prepared a broth with what little remained, roots, barley crumbs, and a generous chunk of aged cheese she called Hard Hope. And strangely, it was delicious. Perhaps because we were hungry, perhaps because that night carried no scent of death, only the simple aroma of steam and rosemary. We sang, timidly at first. Short songs, repeated, some without words, others passed down from the grandmothers of our grandmothers. And as the fire crackled and stars bloomed above us like embers in the sky, I felt a lightness that hadn't visited my shoulders in a long while. No one mentioned the enemy, no one said we won, because we knew the true victory was in simply being there, weary, patched up, but alive. And deep in my heart I understood. Even when war arrives in buckets of misery, even when honor smells of filth and fear lives in the nose, the human spirit, with a sprig of rosemary behind the ear, finds ways to endure and to go on. When dawn finally came, soft and without promises, I climbed the wall one last time. The stones still held the warmth of the day, and the scars of the siege, cracks, dark stains, forgotten scraps of cloth, seemed now a part of the fortress itself, like wrinkles on an old face. I sat there, facing the fields, where dew already settled on the crushed weeds, and for a moment everything felt calm. Not a hollow silence, but that hush that follows weeping after pain, when the world decides to whisper instead of scream. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. The air still carried bitter memories, but also a new freshness, shy like the first bud on snow. I heard light footsteps, perhaps a rat, perhaps a friend. I didn't turn around. I just stayed there, letting the wind tell me stories I didn't yet know. And I knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who's seen the depths of night, that survival isn't just escaping death. It's continuing forward with the scars, the smells, the shocks, and still finding beauty in the crooked corners of life. Still dreaming. The next morning, the gates were opened with effort, as if they too hesitated to return to the world. The light crept in slowly, slipping over the stones, like an old visitor asking for permission. And outside, what we saw was not the enemy, nor destruction, but a resting field, quiet, covered in a low mist that seemed to shield us from the memory of the days before. Grass grew again between the wheel ruts. Timid flowers emerged where camps once stood. Even the crows seemed calmer. The world, I thought, was offering us a pause. As we walked among the abandoned remains, torn canvas, forgotten ropes, signs of haste, no one spoke. It was as if a single word could break the fragile spell of peace floating above us. We gathered what could be reused, bits of iron, stained cloaks that could become blankets. The rest we buried with our hands and with prayers, not out of respect for the enemy, but for ourselves. So that filth would not live with us longer than necessary. And when we finished, dirty with earth, tired but whole, we returned to the fortress with lowered eyes and hearts just a bit lighter. After all, we knew there is no greater victory than simply carrying on, even when everything stinks. The days that followed were made of small new beginnings. Each morning the sun seemed to climb a little higher, as if testing our willingness to live again. The chapel bells, long silent, rang once more, hesitantly, each toll sounding like an ancient sigh. The common tasks, washing, mending, repairing rooftops, became almost sacred. There was comfort in the ordinary, in the predictable. Every loaf that came out of Alea's oven was celebrated like a feast, every feverless night a whispered miracle. And at night, when the torches were snuffed and the wind came down the stone stairs with its cold fingers, we sat around the fire, telling stories that blended fear and bravery, pestilence and poetry. Not to forget, but to remember gently. And before sleep, many still placed dried rosemary on their windowsills, not as protection, but as promise. The promise that even on days when the world smelled like the end, life would still find a way, crooked or shy, to bloom. And that if we listened closely, the silence between the bells could sound like hope. And so, in that fortress marked by sweat, smoke, and silence, life found a new rhythm. A slower rhythm, perhaps, but one full of purpose. Children ran again across the stones, tossing pebbles in forgotten games. The soldiers, now without armor, helped rebuild fences, plant seeds, stitch nets for the wells. There was a strange tenderness in seeing them. Men once made for war, now sweeping gutters with broomsticks of gorse or calming stubborn goats. It was as if peace, suspicious as ever, was testing our ability to welcome it. As for me, I became the herbalist's apprentice. I never imagined I would find joy in drying roots, grinding seeds, or preparing infusions to soothe the mind. But there was something deeply human in those tasks. A return to the small things. An invitation to look down and find beauty in the details. The glint of a droplet on a leaf, the sudden scent of crushed lavender underfoot, the sound of spoons scraping full pots. After so many days surrounded by invisible death, rediscovering the pleasure of tangible life was more than relief. It was redemption. One afternoon, while we gathered elderflowers near the old well, I saw a butterfly land on my sleeve. Its wings, stitched with grey and gold, trembled as if torn between rest and flight. I stood still, breathing in air that no longer smelled of fear. And I thought, even fragile, fleeting things return when the world allows. Even delicate wings find somewhere to land. That's when I understood that our fortress, so battered, was still a place where dreams could live. That night, I wrote for the first time since the siege began. Just one simple phrase, etched in charcoal on a wooden plank nailed beside the tower door. We still live. Nothing more. And the next day, I saw someone had left dried flowers at the foot of it. More phrases came later. Prayers, promises, even jokes. The wood became a wall of memory, not to exalt victories, but to celebrate the quiet resistances, like herbs sprouting through cracks in stone. And there, between words and leaves, we became whole again, still marked, but whole. As the seasons passed, the story of our siege spread beyond the walls. In distant villages, they said we triumphed with courage and faith, when in truth we simply endured with stuffed noses and too much vinegar. Others exaggerated, telling tales of battles that never were, of heroes who never existed, but among us, those who breathed that foul air and slept with soaked cloths on their faces. We knew it was persistence, not the sword, that saved us. The ability to keep going despite the stench, the fear, the doubt, to find meaning in disinfecting a corridor, to keep a candle lit while everything reeked of ending. Today, when I hear children playing among the stones that once saw dirty rain and dung flung with hatred, I feel no shame in the memory. I feel tenderness, because even war, in all its cruelty, couldn't extinguish our will to sing, to sow, to tend the gardens. Some say knights live for the glory of battle. But I've learned there is more glory in still standing after days of mud and plague, with a sprig of rosemary in your pocket and a warm loaf in your hands. That, I believe, is courage. That is victory. And that is how I wish to be remembered, not for what I fought, but for what I helped replant. And now, when winter comes and the hearth crackles softly in the hall, I always return to that plank beside the tower. I read the words written by so many hands, some faded by time, others still fresh like new leaves, and I smile with my eyes. There are names of those who endured, verses scribbled by an apprentice bard, blessings left by women who stitched through the darkest nights. Sometimes someone still leaves flowers or a piece of bread, as if to thank the year for its abundance. No one is told to do it. No one needs to be. It's the kind of memory that blooms on its own, like wild herbs among ancient stones. And as the fire dances nearby and the scent of dried apples with cinnamon floats through the air, I rest my head on crossed arms and let my eyes close. The world can be harsh, yes. It can stink, sicken, and tempt us with despair. But there is something stronger than fear, something that cannot be catapulted, the simple desire to live. To sit around the fire, tell stories in hushed tones, and share silence with those who remained. And with that thought, soft and firm as a well-baked loaf, I drift off on this quiet night, dreaming not of war, but of rosemary sprigs, fresh bread, and the distant chime of a bell that still insists on ringing. The day a king was betrayed during sex and continued until the end. It was a stifling summer night, the kind where the hall's carpet smelled of sweet dust and candle wax dripped lazily down bronze rims. I was far too young then to grasp the whispers echoing through the stone walls, but I remember the scent, jasmine, amber, and a metallic trace in the air. At the time, I served at the court of a king whose fame traveled faster than autumn swallows. A man of fierce beauty, as beloved by some as he was feared by others. His eyes gleamed like polished steel, and his laughter, his laughter, was the sound of goblets clashing in celebration. But like any wild flame, he burned too brightly, and never noticed the shadows growing around him. They say that on that night, the king lay in his favorite tower chamber, wrapped in the red sheets only he used, the color of wine, of desire, and in the end of blood. Beside him, a young woman with copper-colored hair and lashes curled like sickles. She had come from afar, bearing promises of pleasure and not a word of loyalty. The window was ajar, letting in the warm breath of night and the scent of wild lilies from the courtyard. Nothing, absolutely nothing in that scene suggested the horror about to unfold. Yet the corridors whispered, and some doors, though they seemed closed, never truly were. Some swore they heard footsteps in the corridor, slow and deliberate, like a funeral procession disguised as a night patrol. Others said the silence was so thick you could hear the brush of silk against the lover's skin. What is certain is that the door hinges snapped with a sharp crack, like a branch torn by a storm. 3 men entered with hardened eyes and bare blades, drawn by promises of gold and power. One of them hesitated at the sight. The king reclined, still breathless, his sweat glistening in the flickering candlelight, and the girl curled in her own arms like a profane painting. But the monarch merely turned his head, offering a half-smile that bordered on contempt, and returned to what he was doing, as if the intruders were nothing more than wind beyond the window. "Finish when I do," he's said to have muttered, his voice heavy with the tone of one who had never been defied. It was a moment that split the room in two, those who thought of stepping back and those who gripped their sword hilts tighter. The king, in his naked glory, looked invincible. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps madness, or maybe it was a final act of defiance, as if even fate had to wait its turn. There were no screams, only the click of boots on marble and the muffled sigh of a woman. The lover, pale as a handkerchief left too long in the sun, did not move. They say she never cried, not that night, not ever. She only closed her eyes, like someone hoping not to wake up. It was then that the silence broke, not with a scream or a strike, but with the melancholic sound of a silver goblet falling to the floor. One of the men hesitated, moved perhaps by a thread of shame, or by that kind of fear that does not come from steel, but from conscience. The king rose, not in haste, but with the slow precision of someone still in command of the scene. He faced the three, as though measuring the weight of betrayal in each of their eyes. "Cowards," he murmured, more to himself than to them, while reaching for the carved hilt dagger left on the table. He didn't raise it. He only held it, like someone caressing an old habit that would not save his life. The young woman, curled in the sheets, said nothing. Perhaps she knew what was to come. Perhaps she accepted that to lie with kings was sometimes to wake beside shadows. The men stepped forward, reluctant, as if the very air pushed them back. But the choice had already been made, not by them, but by that suspended moment between duty and absurdity. The first blow came without honor from behind. The king gasped but did not fall. He turned, eyes filled with calm contempt, and spoke something no one has ever been able to repeat with certainty. Some say it was a curse. Others, a twisted blessing. What is known is that he smiled before collapsing. When the guards arrived, too late, or perhaps simply indifferent, they found the body still warm, fallen like a discarded cloak on the scarlet-stained carpets. The young woman, motionless beside him, stared into the void like someone watching the past slip through her fingers. No one touched her, no one dared. One of them, superstitious, made the sign of the cross before stepping back in silence. The scene had become legend before the dawn even broke, and as crows began circling the castle's ramparts, the neighboring chambers were lit, not from need, but from fear. It was said the king's spirit would roam those stones, forever seeking the ending that had been interrupted. In the days that followed, the conspirators received what they had sought: power, gold, the keys to halls they had only dreamed of. But none of them truly smiled. It was as if the act had left an invisible mark, something no crown or fortune could cleanse. One went mad the following winter, raving that he saw the king, naked, bleeding, and still standing. Another died poisoned by unknown hands. Some suspected the lover, who vanished on a cold night without a trace, without even a shadow. And the third, well, they say he wandered the forests like a caged wolf, murmuring senseless words and clutching his chest as if trying to hold shut a wound that never bled. The tower where it all took place was sealed shortly after. No one slept there again. The keys were hidden, and the carpets burned under the pretense of purification. But on moonless nights, the servants claimed to hear soft footsteps on the marble and the creak of the royal bed, as if someone still moved between invisible sheets. Some even swore they could smell a perfume in the air, amber, jasmine, and a warm trace of iron. Those walls, they said, did not want silence. They wanted memory. And so, even without statue or epitaph, the king who chose desire over defense was immortalized, not for his bravery, but for his unthinkable defiance. Today, when I pass through the old corridors of that castle, or what remains of it, I close my eyes for a moment and listen. There's something in the stone, in the moss that grows in the cracks, in the windows that still groan when the northern wind blows strong. Something that tells me pride, when carried too far, turns even pleasure into tragedy. But there's also a strange beauty in it, in choosing to die as one lived, without disguises, without retreat. They say kings should die with sword in hand. Ours, however, departed with a hand tangled in a lover's skin, a heart laid bare, and a smile that seemed to say, with quiet arrogance, "Interrupt me, if you dare." And so the story spread, not through official chronicles, which chose silence over scandal, but through the mouths of servants, of bards, of gossiping midwives who knew better than any scribe where blood truly spilled. It passed from village to village, changing over time, of course. In some versions, the king fought to the end. In others, he didn't even turn around. But what never changed was the astonishment at his decision to remain, to continue, as if the blade were no more threatening than the judgment of a desire left incomplete. And that is why, centuries later, this tale is still told beside campfires and sipped between mouthfuls of cheap wine, a reminder that even the mighty may lose themselves in the small stubbornness of the flesh. I first heard it from an old monk, who swore he found a fragment of a letter in the archives of a convent, hastily written, its ink faded and the edges scorched. In it, an anonymous maiden wrote, "He chose to finish pleasure rather than save his life." And in that moment I understood. Some would rather die whole than live in halves. Those words have stayed with me ever since, like an ember hidden beneath the ashes of memory. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is why I like to repeat them on nights like this. When the breeze is soft, the candle flickers gently on the table, and our hearts settle quietly among shadows and stories. Some laugh at this tale, calling it exaggeration or the invention of centuries that love a scandal. But if you've lived long enough to see a man look death in the eye and still choose desire, then you know, certain truths need no proof. They simply exist, like the warmth of an old embrace or the taste of the first autumn apple. The king was a fool, yes, proud, but he was also human, fiercely human. And perhaps that is why his memory remains so vivid, not because of the crown he wore, but because of the absurd, bold, final choice he made. This is but one among the many stories the centuries keep in their threadbare pockets. And on this quiet night, as darkness stretches gently across your windows and silence settles into your room's corners, I hope it serves not as a tale of horror, but as a reminder that even the mighty succumb to the heart's impulses, and that sometimes, foolish as it may seem, to continue until the end is the only gesture we have left to say to the world, I was, truly, myself. Sleep well, traveler. And may the echoes of this story keep you company, softly, as dreams begin to approach like light footsteps in stone corridors. The magic pillows that promised erotic dreams in the Middle Ages. There was a village, not much different from others, surrounded by silent hills and woods that exhaled resin and lavender at dusk. I lived there many winters ago, when the chapel bells were still pure bronze and children ran barefoot chasing goats. Our house was simple, wood, stone, and the constant scent of darkened bread in the oven. But what made that place special wasn't the sky dotted with stars, nor the summers full of wild strawberries. It was a woman with steady hands and cloudy eyes who stitched dreams inside pillows. Not just any dreams, but dreams that burned, floated, and whispered names the heart had hidden. They said she was once a midwife. Others swore she was an ancient healer, too old to even remember her true name. I called her simply Vela. She lived at the edge of the forest, in a cabin covered with ivy and snowbells, with doors that creaked as if guarding secrets. People came from far away to see her, not for teas to cure fevers or plasters for pain, but for what only she knew how to make, the magic pillows. Vela said, the soul sees clearer when the body sleeps, and that if the pillow was well prepared, sleep became a bridge. A bridge to ancient desires, to meetings never lived, and answers that the waking world would never give. The pillows were not made of straw or wool like common ones. She would open them with a small knife worn at the handle, and there, with fingers stained by elderflower dyes, she began the ritual. There were golden threads harvested from virgin's hair, always given with consent and blessing. Herbs were dried under specific moons, verbena to ignite memory, rosemary to chase away fear, and a rare root brought from distant monasteries that made dreams sing. Vela sewed everything with red thread, reciting words that sounded like wind over ancient parchment. And finally, right in the center, she placed a moonstone, cold to the touch, but capable of pulsing softly when the pillow was first embraced. Receiving one of those pillows was not like buying an object. It was more like carrying a sleeping spell. Each one was unique. Some came with tiny bird bones from birds that had died naturally, wrapped in strips of linen. Others held dried petals of flowers that never bloomed again in the region. Single women asked for pillows to dream of the face of a future husband. Widows wished to revisit, for one last night, the touch of a love that had departed. Silent men, even the toughest, sometimes came secretly, seeking a vision to warm, cold, lonely nights. I was too young to understand it all at the time, but one night, Vela called me. She said I had begun to dream of eyes I did not know, and that meant the world of sleep already recognized me as a traveler. She handed me a small pillow wrapped in blue linen. It was no bigger than my belly, and it exuded a sweet scent, like incense and wet wood. Tonight, sleep with it beneath your head. And if someone calls your name inside the dream, do not fear, just listen. Her whisper seemed to scratch time itself, and as I walked back home, the light weight of that pillow felt unlike anything I had ever held. I fell asleep to the sound of the hearth, the pillow beneath my head, and a heavy blanket over my shoulders. The house was quiet, save for the crackle of burning wood and the wind blowing through the cracks in the window. It was a swift sleep, like sinking down. And there, in the world where logic bends and senses blur, I found myself walking through a meadow that existed on no map. The grass was purple, the sky golden, and in the distance there was a figure, tall, wrapped in a cloak of mist and tenderness. She called my name, not the name used in the village, but an ancient name that rang like bells inside my chest. And I, without fear, went to her. We spoke not with words. Everything was gesture, music, memory. Her hands touched my face, and in them was the softness of the first touch I had never received. It was a dream, yes, but not just any dream. It was as if someone who had waited centuries for me had finally found me. I woke before dawn, the pillow still warm beneath my head, my heart pounding as if it had run inside someone's soul. When I told Vela, she only smiled and said, "You have been remembered." Those words echoed inside me for many days, even when the pillow began to lose its scent and the world pulled me back to chores and harvests. After that night, I began to notice the whispered stories in lazy afternoons by the fountain. Women said they had been visited by lovers long gone, but who now came smiling, their eyes shining beneath the mist of dreams. An old man who always slept alone swore he had seen his wife dancing barefoot in a flowered field, just as she had in youth. There were also those who said they dreamed of figures they dared not describe, angels perhaps, or demons with familiar faces hidden beneath veils of desire and longing. And always, at the end of the tale, their eyes shone as if still dreaming. Not all dreams were gentle. Sometimes the pillows awakened buried memories, secrets of body and soul. A maiden dreamed she kissed someone she had never touched, and woke crying, not from shame, but tenderness. A silent man told, between sips of wine, that he saw his father telling him things he had never dared say in life. Vela said the pillows did not give what we wanted, but what we needed. Dreams are letters the gods send us when we are quiet enough to listen, she said, sewing in silence, eyes fixed on her embroidery, as if she had translated too many secrets to still be surprised by them. With time, Vela's pillows spread beyond our village borders. Knights, nobles, even clerics came seeking them in secret, as if the very quest for a beautiful dream were a weakness they could not admit aloud. Each brought a different payment: silver coins, necklaces with holy pendants, or whispered promises never to be collected. But Vela rarely asked for gold. She preferred subtler offerings, a sprig of lavender gathered in dew, a song sung from the heart, or a story never told to anyone. Once, a traveler with a weary face came seeking a pillow to dream of someone he never met. "I only know her name," he said, "and that she smiled while embroidering." Vela listened silently, as one who hears pain for the first time. That night, she lit all the cabin's candles and prepared a pillow without a word. When handing it over, she said only, "You will remember what you never lived." And the man left, the object wrapped like a reliquary. We never saw him again. But for a long time, troubadours sang of a man who dreamed so much of love, he ended up lost among the sheets of his own desire. There was something sacred in the silences that surrounded these pillows. No one displayed them proudly, nor offered them as gifts. They were intimate objects, almost alive, holding the breath of the one who stitched them and the longing of the one who sought them. Some people, after dreaming deeply, buried their pillows beneath a tree or burned them at sunrise. They said it was the way to seal what they had seen, as if dreams needed a tomb or a pyre to rest. Others kept them all their lives, even after the scents faded and the herbs dried, just to have them near, to remember that once they had been touched by something they could not name. I kept mine for many years, hidden in a wooden box beneath the bedroom floor. On stormy nights, when the wind seemed to whisper forgotten names and the windows trembled as if the house breathed, I took it out, hugged it, and let sleep carry me away. I never dreamed again of that figure in the golden meadow, but the dreams changed. Sometimes it was a scent, a laugh, a feeling that someone watched me with tenderness from afar, as if the pillow were an always open bridge, but to directions we do not choose. When at last my old age arrived with the softness of a long autumn, I understood what Vela had always meant, that some meetings need no words, silence, sleep, and a pillow that knows how to listen. Now that the years rest upon my shoulders like a well-knitted cloak, I look back and understand that those dreams were not merely nightly visits. They were borrowed memories of something that lives inside us all. The desire to be seen, to be touched by a glance, to be remembered even when alone. The magic pillow, with its ancient herbs and lines stitched beneath murmurs, was not a relic of witchcraft, but a reminder that love lives in the cracks of the world, even when it does not show itself during the day. When Vela passed away, on a morning wrapped in mist and crow song, the whole village felt as if a door had closed, a door leading to the sweetest, boldest, truest dreams. But beside her bed lay one last pillow, left upon a white linen quilt. No one dared touch it. It stayed there for days, exuding a light scent of wildflowers and hearth smoke, as if waiting for someone. And perhaps it still waits. For they say some dreams do not die. They only change homes, searching for a weary head where they may rest. So, if someday you feel a pillow embracing you in a different way, do not be surprised. It may have come from far away, very far away. The witchcraft of menstrual baths offered as love potions. For many winters, I lived with my aunt in a village now nothing more than moss-covered ruins, nestled among the damp hills of the north. Her house smelled of sweet wine and dry leaves, and its windows were always ajar, as if the wind were a trusted visitor. At night, she lit candles with wicks dipped in lavender oil and told stories no one else dared repeat. Stories drawn from hidden manuscripts, whispered confessions among healers, or notes rescued from the bottom of wells. And among all these memories that seemed to float in the thick air of the hearth, there was one that always gave me curious shivers. The tale of women who offered a part of themselves, quite literally, as a love spell. My aunt called it the bond bath, and spoke of it not with scandal, but with the reverence of one who knows the weight of desire. She told me that in ancient times, certain women collected their blood from the cycle and mixed it with deep red wine or macerated rose oil, creating a warm, earthy, and slightly sweet potion. It was something too intimate to explain clearly, but not rarely this liquid was secretly offered to the beloved man, often during a toast or a ceremonial bath. It was not merely an enchantment, but an ancestral pact, sealed with what nature gave them month after month as a reminder of the life they could create or bind. They said that upon drinking this potion, unaware of its origin, the man would begin to dream of the woman who prepared it. Not only her face, but the scent of her hair, the timbre of her voice, and even the silent gesture she made when sewing or fetching water from the well. He would become, little by little, wrapped in a soft haze of enchantment, longing for her presence, yearning for her touch, missing her as if something essential was absent from his flesh. Some men resisted, others surrendered without knowing why, but the connection that formed was described as an invisible thread, pulling the heart through the skin. There were risks, of course. My aunt warned that such a spell was no frivolous act of a lovesick girl, but a profound gesture, surrounded by forces we do not always understand. Blood was seen in many cultures as a symbol of power and sacredness, and menstrual blood even more so, for it came without wound and renewed itself with the moon. What was taboo in the eyes of the church became sacred in the eyes of the ancients. Women who knew the cycles of the earth, who spoke with seeds, and who trusted more in their instincts than in sermons. Preparing such a potion was an act of courage, but also of surrender. For to enchant another, my aunt whispered, one must accept that a part of oneself also becomes bound in the spell. I remember one night I asked, heart heavy with curiosity, if she had ever witnessed the ritual. She smiled sideways, as one who hears an old echo from the past, and simply answered, some women need no words to be remembered, and others know the exact moment to offer a chalice. After that she fell silent, stirring a dark leaf infusion in her clay bowl, letting the bitter aroma fill the room. At that moment, I realized some stories are not told, only hinted at, left in the air like smoke, dancing between candlelight and shadow of doubt. With time, I understood these rituals, as frightening as they may seem to modern eyes, were born from a time when love was often silenced, contained, watched over. Women could not openly declare their desires, so they created hidden paths, ways to touch the heart of those they loved without breaking imposed rules. A bath with oils, a sip of wine heavy with intention, a long look beneath the veil. Nothing was said clearly, but everything was felt. And at the center of that delicate silence, blood became a symbol not of impurity, as many feared, but of power, of creation, of life that pulses, even unseen. There was also an ancient belief, passed mouth to mouth, that cycle blood contained memories, not only of the body, but of the emotions lived by the woman who shed it. A kind of invisible ink where were inscribed the fears, desires, longings, and dreams she carried silently. By drinking the potion, the man did not just connect to the woman's body, but to what she felt. It was a raw and beautiful form of sharing, like one who, without words, offers the most intimate part of themselves. To some, it was magic. To others, madness. To my aunt, it was simply the way some souls found to truly be seen. Of course, there were judgments. There always are. The church condemned anything outside the norm, and men who discovered the spell often wavered between fascination and fury. But still, these practices survived, hidden behind village curtains, noted in wax-covered grimoires, and concealed beneath loose floorboards. They were secrets among women, passed as invisible inheritances, taught between teas and embroidery, between births and funerals, between whispered confidences at dusk. And perhaps that is why such rituals still echo, not loudly, but in murmurs that resist time. On the quietest nights, when mist covered the fields and the sound of crickets seemed distant, my aunt would light a thicker candle made with sheep fat and burned herbs and say it was time to remember the brave. We sat close to the fire, she with a shawl over her shoulders and I with my hands tucked into my dress sleeves, and then she spoke of women who dared to love fiercely and who, for that, were called witches. Not because they flew or cast curses, but because they knew the body, the herbs, and how the heart sometimes needs an invisible push to surrender. These women, she said, wrote no poetry nor left portraits, but their spells, those endured. One of them, she said, was prepared during the bath, The woman washed herself in warm water mixed with petals and dry leaves, letting fall in the final rinse drops of freshly gathered blood. Then she mixed the liquid with red wine and a pinch of cinnamon to sharpen the heat of the womb. In silence, she brought the chalice to the chosen man, hiding her blush beneath shy smiles. And when he drank, the enchantment began, not with fire or visions, but with a subtle unrest. A slow, growing desire, a memory of her that returned always, even when he tried to forget. As days passed, the man began to notice details once invisible, how the light danced in her hair, the sound of her laughter from afar, the faint scent she left in the air as she passed. He found himself distracted, repeating her name without meaning to, searching for her with his eyes, even in crowds of dozens of faces. He did not understand why, but there was in her a kind of gentle gravity, something pulling him close, without hurry, without explanation. Some said it was witchcraft, others love. But maybe it was just the effect of having been touched, even secretly, by a will that bled truth. My aunt told me that not all these stories ended well, nor badly. Some women married their enchanted and lived long winters together, sharing soups, children, and the warmth of the same blanket. Others walked away when they realized the passion they created was more than they could carry, and there were those who, even forgotten by the man, held within them the certainty that they were, for a moment, irresistible. And that was enough. Because more than binding another, these spells served to remind the woman she had power. That even in a world that silenced her, she could, somehow, author her own fate. With the years, I came to see this ritual not as something dark, but as a kind of hidden poetry, written with the body, with time, with the courage of those who knew that to love was also to risk. And though I never witnessed such a potion being offered, I sometimes think I felt its traces in certain glances exchanged by the well, or in cups shared with more intention than thirst. In a small village, where winds spread secrets and old women know more than they say, love was rarely just chance. It came seasoned with silence, herbs, and perhaps a touch of enchantment. Even today, when I smell warm wine or see flowers floating in a tub forgotten under the sun, I'm carried back to that modest house where my aunt slept with grimoires under her pillow and words held between her teeth. I do not know if all that was real, or if she made the magic just so I would learn not to fear what I carry inside me. But I know I never looked at desire the same way again. Because in the end, what those women sought was not control, but presence. They wanted to be seen, felt, remembered. And if for that they needed to turn blood into a toast, so be it. For loving sometimes is also an act of witchcraft. And so, with time, I understood there was a serene beauty in this kind of enchantment, not for its power, but for its intention. Offering something so intimate, so visceral, was like extending the soul silently and trusting it would be received with care. There was risk, of course, but there was also tenderness, a desire for connection that surpassed touch and reached something deeper, memory. For even if the spell broke, even if life took different paths, the one who drank from that cup would never forget the taste, nor who offered it. And that is why on cold nights like this, when the wind scratches the tiles and the fire's flames dance slowly, I still think of those women with fondness. Not as feared witches, but as guardians of desire, mystery, and the courage to love in their own way. May their names, erased by centuries, still live in the scent of wine, in the whisper of herbs, and in the stories we tell by lamplight. For there are rituals that need no longer be practiced, only remembered, and by remembering them gently, we keep them alive.